At 65, Nora Gaines had $178, a pair of rubber boots she'd owned for 20 years, and a deed to a grist mill that had been standing in 8 inches of water since the spring flood of 2019. Her daughter had handled the paperwork with an attorney named Clive, who wore a burgundy tie and spoke to Nora the way people speak to someone they're not sure can follow along. The house had been in Nora's name too, technically, until the documents were explained to her, and the pen was placed in her hand, and she signed because Laurel was her daughter, and she had spent 40 years not making things difficult. The savings account had taken 11 minutes to redirect. The mill, on the other hand, nobody wanted. Not Laurel. Not Clive. Not the county, which had already assessed it as a liability. It sat at the end of a logging road 2 miles outside of Garnett, Tennessee, and it had been sitting there since 1887. And 8 inches of standing water was the least of its problems. What nobody knew, what Nora herself did not know, until she pushed open the mill door and stepped into the cold dark, was that her late husband's father had spent 31 years hiding something in the room above the wheel. The attorney's office was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparer. Clive had arranged the chairs so that Laurel sat beside him and Nora sat across, which meant Nora spent the appointment looking at 2 people who had already agreed on things before she arrived. Laurel was 51 years old and wore a blazer to the meeting and did not meet Nora's eyes for the first 20 minutes. She had a way of framing things that made the framing sound like concern. The house was too big for one person. The savings were complicated to manage at Nora's stage of life. Clive would handle the transfer cleanly. No probate, no delays. Nora would receive the mill property, assessed at negative value, given the flood remediation costs, but hers outright, and a one-time payment of $4,200 to help with transition expenses. Nora did not say anything. She looked at Laurel's blazer. She looked at Clive's tie. She picked up the pen. On the way out, she passed a coat rack in the hall and took her jacket off it, the canvas one with the flannel lining she'd worn every winter since 1998, and in the right pocket was what she always kept there, a photograph. Wallet sized, creased down the middle, edges gone soft. Walter at 34, standing in front of the mill on the day his father gave him the key. Walter was grinning. His father, Cass Gaines, stood beside him with one hand on Walter's shoulder and his hat in his other hand, squinting into the sun. Nora had found the photo in Walter's nightstand after he died and had carried it ever since without quite deciding why. She sat in her car in the strip mall parking lot for a long time, holding it. Then she drove to the mill. The logging road was worse than she remembered. The Civic bottomed out twice before she gave up and walked the last quarter mile in the rubber boots, carrying a flashlight and the canvas jacket and nothing else. The road followed Garnett Creek, and the creek was running high for August, brown at the edges, and she could hear the wheel before she could see the building. A slow, reluctant turning, one full rotation every few seconds, the way it had always moved when the creek ran fast. The mill came into view through a stand of sycamore. 4 stories of board and batten, vertical siding gone gray, the kind of gray that takes a century to arrive at. The foundation was limestone block, hand-laid, 2 feet thick. Moss had taken the north wall from ground to second-story window. 3 of the 4 loading doors had swollen shut. The sign above the main door, Gaines Mill EST, 1887, had faded to shadows of letters, but the limestone lintel above it was sound, and the door itself, when she pushed it, moved. Inside, the smell hit her first. Mill pond water and old wood and something underneath, flour dust. Still, after years of nothing being ground, the floor was wide plank pine, and half of it was warped from the flooding, boards lifting at the edges. The water had receded to a thin skin across the far corner near the wheel housing. A rusted chain hoist hung from a ceiling beam. The grinding stones were still in place, 2 of them, 4 feet across. The runner stone tilted slightly off-center, as if someone had started to adjust it and been interrupted. Nora walked the perimeter, hands on walls. The limestone was solid and dry. She knocked in 3 places. No hollow sound, no movement, no give. The structural posts were 6 by 6 white oak, and she pressed her thumbnail into the nearest one, and it didn't yield. They were standing. Whatever the water had done to the floor, it hadn't touched the bones. In the northeast corner, a staircase. Narrow, steep, the handrail worn smooth, where 100 years of hands had gripped it going up. She climbed. The second floor was dry, completely dry. Someone had built it that way deliberately. The floor joists were set higher than standard. The exterior siding on this level was double-layered, and the 2 windows on the east wall had been reframed and reglazed, recently enough that the caulk was still pliable. The room held a wooden table, 2 ladder-back chairs, a cast-iron wood stove with a quarter cord of split hickory stacked beside it, and a green metal shelving unit along the back wall, 8 feet wide, 5 shelves, filled with banker's boxes, each one labeled in blue marker. Nora stood in the doorway for a moment. She counted 18 boxes. She went to the nearest one. The label read, Alderman, B&T, 1994 to 2003. She lifted the lid. Inside, a handwritten ledger page, a stack of carbon copies, and a rubber-banded packet of correspondence. She unfolded the ledger page. A name, a date, an amount. A second amount. A running balance she couldn't immediately decode. A note in the margin in her father-in-law's handwriting, the cramped right-leaning hand she recognized from Christmas cards. Truck loan. Bert laid off December. Do not record against him. She stood there with the ledger page in her hand for a while. Then she pulled the table closer to the window and sat down and started opening boxes. Cass Gaines had died in 2014 at the age of 89, and Nora had known him for 37 years and had understood him, she thought, reasonably well. A quiet man. A man who said less than he meant and meant considerably more than he said. He had run the mill until 1991, when the economics of small batch milling finally stopped working. And after that he had kept the building and done what he called maintenance and come out here 2 or 3 times a week until his knees made the logging road impractical. He had not talked about the mill much. He had not talked about much of anything much. That was Cass. She had not known about the boxes. The earliest one dated to 1983. The most recent was labeled 2013, the year before he died. 30 years of boxes, 18 in total, each covering a 2 to 4 year span, each holding the same categories of contents, ledger pages, carbons of bank drafts and money orders, and handwritten notes that ran from a few lines to several pages. Nora read for 4 hours. By the time the light through the east windows went amber and then pink, she understood the basic shape of what Cass had been doing, though the full dimensions of it were still coming clear. He had been forgiving debts, not large debts, not mortgages, not business loans. The amounts ranged from $140 to $8,000, and most of them clustered between $400 and $2,500. Medical co-pays, heating oil, car repairs, grocery tabs at the store on Route 9 that had closed in 2008, school fees, veterinary bills, funeral costs. The notes beside each entry were brief and procedural, paid direct to clinic, anonymous, sent as cashier's check, no return address, settled through the feed store account, Harlan doesn't know source, but occasionally longer. And the longer ones were where Cass allowed himself something closer to a record of who these people were. August 14, 1997, Meredith Foss came by the mill to return the $600 I sent for her boy's surgery. She'd found out somehow. I told her it was from a community fund, which isn't entirely a lie since the community is where the money comes from and where it goes. She cried. I told her I didn't know anything about any fund and she ought to talk to the Methodist Church. She's going to keep looking. I hope she gives up. It's not about the money coming back. It never was. Nora sat with that one for a long time. She found her own name at 6:47 by her watch, in a 2008 entry, in the middle of the 7th box. November 3rd, 2008, Walter called about the layoff. 200 people at the plant, he said, and he was quiet in the way he gets when the thing is worse than the words. Nora will hold them together. She always does. She has a kind of toughness that doesn't look like toughness. It looks like patience. But it's not patience. It's a decision she makes every morning to keep going regardless. I don't know if I ever told her I see that. I should have told her. Walter's going to be all right. Nora will make sure of it. She put the ledger page down flat on the table. She did not cry. She pressed both palms against the wood of the table and looked at the wall and breathed, and after a while the thing that was pressing against her chest eased enough to let air through. Outside, the wheel turned. The creek moved. The light went from pink to gray to dark. She did not go back to the car. She slept in one of the ladder-back chairs with the canvas jacket over her shoulders and the photograph of Walter and Cass in her hand. And in the morning when she woke up, the stovepipe was cold and the room smelled like wood and old paper, and she felt, in a way she could not have explained, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She found the wood stove lighter on the shelf beside the hickory and got a fire going and was on her second cup of instant coffee. There was a box of it in the shelving unit, and a camp kettle, and a tin mug, as if Cass had always known someone would need these things, when she heard a truck on the logging road. An old Dodge, dark blue, missing the passenger mirror. A woman got out, maybe 70, wearing a rain slicker and carrying a paper grocery sack. She had short white hair and the deliberate walk of someone whose joints have opinions. She stopped at the mill door and called up. "Somebody up there?" "Come up," Nora said. The woman's name was May Cutler. She had driven out, she said, because her son had driven past Nora's Civic on the road and mentioned it to her, and she had put two and two together. She set the grocery sack on the table, bread, a brick of sharp cheddar, a jar of chow chow, 2 apples, and looked at the open banker's boxes without comment. "You found his room," May said. "His room," Nora repeated. "That's what I always called it. Cass's room." She sat down in the other chair and folded her hands on the table. "He asked me not to tell Walter. Or you. He was very particular about that." She looked out the east window. "My husband had a gambling problem for 11 years. Not cards. Horses. Cass paid off the feed store debt in 1989, the one that would have put us under. And he told Dale it was a loan from the co-op, and Dale believed him, because Dale believed what he needed to believe back then." She was quiet for a moment. "Dale's been sober since 1991. 33 years. I don't know that he'd have gotten there if the weight of the debt had stayed on him. Cass thought a man couldn't breathe his way clear with that much pressing down." Nora looked at the boxes. "How many people knew?" she said. "Knew it was Cass?" May shook her head. A handful figured it out. Nobody talked. It seemed like the thing to do was not talk. She stood up and smoothed her slicker. "There's more people in this valley who owe something to that man than you know, and since you're here, I expect they'll start finding their way out." She picked up her keys. I'll be back Thursday with soup. If you've made it this far into Nora's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not to the mill, to Nora's sister's house in Garnet, where Nora had been collecting mail. Letterhead she didn't recognize. An attorney named Breslin, firm address in Knoxville. The letter explained, in the measured language of someone who has written many such letters, that a client had identified the Gaines Mill property as having significant development potential. That questions existed regarding the clarity of the deed transfer given the estate's complexity, and that his client was prepared to offer $47,000 for a clean sale, which Breslin characterized as generous given the remediation costs and the property's current assessed value. Attached was a one-page purchase agreement, a line for her signature at the bottom. Nora put the letter on the table in the mill room and went to the green shelving unit. She found the box labeled Property and Legal behind the others on the bottom shelf. Inside, the original mill deed from 1887, a chain of title running 11 pages, a 1974 document transferring ownership from Cass's father to Cass, and a 2009 document transferring ownership from Cass to Walter and Nora jointly, witnessed, notarized, recorded with Harlan County. And below that, a sealed envelope labeled "For whoever needs this," in Cass's handwriting. Inside the envelope, a letter from a Knoxville attorney named Patricia Wills, dated 2009, confirming that the mill and its half-acre lot had been placed in a family trust structured to pass to the surviving spouse of any Gaines heir, that the trust superseded any subsequent estate proceeding, and that no instruments signed at the personal property level could encumber or transfer the mill without trustee consent. There was also a business card clipped to the letter. Patricia Wills, still at the same firm. Nora called the number. Patricia Wills answered on the third ring and sounded unsurprised. "Cass called me in 2012, she said. "He said someone would eventually try to take it. He wanted to make sure the structure held." She paused. "He also told me something else. He said if anyone ever called about this property and sounded like they didn't know what they'd inherited, I should tell them. The room above the wheel is the point. The mill is just the walls around it." "I understand," Nora said. "I'll send a letter to Breslin today. You won't hear from him again. What do I owe you?" A pause. "My mother had a tab at the feed store that she couldn't pay in 2003. Someone settled it anonymously. I've been wondering for 20 years who it was." Another pause. "I think I know now." Nora did not hear from Breslin again. That evening she opened the last box on the shelving unit, the one she had saved. It was smaller than the others, a shoebox, not a banker's box, and it was not labeled with dates or names. It was labeled, simply, Nora, inside, a single envelope. Her name on the front in the cramped right-leaning hand. Not sealed, just folded shut, the flap tucked in. She sat on the chair by the window and read it while the last light came through the glass. "Nora, I've been meaning to write this since 2001, and I kept putting it off the way you put off the things that matter most, which is a particular kind of foolishness I recognize in myself and never managed to fix. You have been the best thing that happened to this family in my lifetime, and I mean that to include my own children and grandchildren, who are good people, but who are good partly because of you. You know how to hold a thing together without making it feel held. That is rarer than people understand. Walter was my son, and I loved him without reservation, but I watched him the way a father watches a son who has more heart than direction. And what I watched was you, year after year, making up the difference without complaint and without credit. I should have said it plainly when I could. I'm saying it now, and I'm sorry it took me so long. The mill is yours. The room is yours. The boxes are for you to do with what you think is right. I have one request. There is a list in the small red notebook on the bottom shelf, behind the property box. Names I didn't get to. People I ran out of time for. If you have time and the means and the inclination, and I think you will, I'd be grateful. You were always the right person for this. I knew it from the day Walter brought you home. Nora folded the letter. She pressed it flat against the canvas jacket over her chest. She sat that way while the light went out of the window, and the mill went dark around her, and the wheel turned in the creek below, and the hickory in the stove ticked down. Then she found the small red notebook on the bottom shelf. She opened it to the first page. There were 41 names. The first repair was the floor. She pulled the warped boards herself, one by one, prying them up with a flat bar she found hanging in the wheel housing. It took a week. The subfloor beneath was sound. The flooding had gotten under the finish floor, but not the structure, and she stacked the pulled boards along the east wall to dry and reuse where she could. She was on her knees fitting a new board into the gap near the east door on a Thursday morning when a truck she didn't recognize came down the logging road. A man got out, maybe 40, wearing paint-splattered Carhartt and carrying a belt sander. "Tommy Alderman," he said. "My folks are Bert and Teresa. You've got a box with their name on it upstairs." Nora sat back on her heels and looked at him. "I heard you were fixing the place," he said. "I do finish carpentry. I'm good with floors." He held up the sander. "I don't want paying." She looked at the belt sander. She looked at the boards stacked along the wall. "You know how to scribe a board to limestone?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you can start with the north section." Tommy Alderman worked 4 days on the floor and then started coming by on weekends. He brought his brother-in-law once, a man named Gary who knew masonry, and spent a Saturday repointing the mortar on the ground floor's north wall without being asked. May Cutler came on Thursdays with food and stayed to help sort the banker's boxes into a system Nora was building. A ledger of the ledgers, a map of what Cass had done and where it had gone, and what, if anything, remained unfinished. Word moved through Garnet the way water moves through limestone, slow and then everywhere at once. People Nora had not met arrived with lumber and roofing tar, and once, inexplicably, a new cast-iron drain pipe for the wheel housing that someone had fabricated at a shop in town. Each of them, when she asked, said some version of the same thing. Cass had helped their family once. They were glad someone was out here now. They'd been wondering what would happen to the place. She did not tell any of them about the red notebook. She worked through it quietly, the way Cass had worked through his boxes. A furnace, a car repair, a medical bill for a woman named Sylvie Rains that had been sitting with a collections agency for 4 years. She sent the payments through a post office box she opened in Knoxville. She signed nothing. She wrote community fund in the memo line. Meredith Foss's name was on the list. The same Meredith Foss from the 1997 entry, the one who had tried to return the $600 and been redirected to the Methodist Church. Cass had written beside her name, "Never fully settled. Owes nothing. Make sure she knows." Nora drove to Meredith Foss's house on a Tuesday. She was 73, small, with the alert eyes of someone who has learned to watch for things. She met Nora on the porch and looked at her for a long moment before either of them spoke. "You're Walter's wife," Meredith said. "I am. You look like you have something to tell me. Your debt to the mill was forgiven in 1997. Cass Gaines wanted you to know it was him. He should have told you then. He didn't. I'm telling you now." Meredith Foss looked at her for a long time. She didn't say anything. Then she reached out and took Nora's hand and held it for a moment and let go. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." In October, a girl appeared at the bottom of the logging road, young, 20. maybe 21. She was carrying a backpack and a garbage bag, and she had the look of someone who had been making do for long enough that making do had stopped feeling like a temporary condition. She stood at the tree line and looked up at the mill as if she was calculating something. Nora was on the second floor and saw her through the east window. She went down and stood in the door. "I heard there might be work," the girl said. Her name was Iris. She'd been staying in her car for 6 weeks, she said, and the car had died the previous Thursday, and someone in town had mentioned the mill was being fixed up and might need help. "What can you do?" Nora said. "Anything. I'm not particular." Nora looked at her. The garbage bag. The backpack with a broken strap held together with a carabiner. The way she stood with her weight on one foot, already slightly sideways, already half ready to be sent away. "There's a room up here," Nora said. "Wood stove, cot, blankets. You can stay there while you're working. There's no wage yet, but there will be." Iris looked at her straight on. "Why?" Nora thought about how to answer that. "Because the man who owned this place before me believed that a person carrying too much weight can't stand up straight," she said. "And that if you're in a position to take something off somebody's shoulders, you do it. That's the whole reason." Iris came inside. Laurel came in November. She came alone, without Clive or an attorney or any explanation of how she'd found the logging road. She parked next to Tommy Alderman's truck and walked to the mill door in heels that were wrong for the gravel. She stood in the ground floor and looked at the new pine boards, the repointed walls, the chain hoist oiled and hanging straight. She came upstairs. She stood in the doorway of the room and looked at the shelving unit and the stove and the table where Iris was doing paperwork and Nora was reading through the last of the banker's boxes. It was a long moment. "I didn't know about any of this," Laurel said. "No," Nora said, "neither did I." Laurel looked at the boxes. She looked at the wheel through the east window, still turning. "I brought something." She held out an envelope. Inside was a check. $4,200, the transition payment from the estate. "I'd like you to take it back. You don't need to do that. I know I don't need to." She set the envelope on the table. "I'd like to." Nora looked at her daughter. She looked at the envelope. She picked it up. "There's coffee," she said. Laurel nodded. They did not talk about the house or the savings or the meeting with Clive. They talked about other things. Laurel's job, the winter coming, the floor that still needed finishing in the north corner. Laurel held her coffee mug in both hands the way she had when she was small. Nora noticed that. She didn't say anything. Before she left, Laurel stopped at the top of the stairs. "Daddy would have liked it," she said. "What you've done with it." Nora thought about the photograph in her pocket. Walter at 34. Cass with his hat off, squinting into the sun. "Yes," she said. "He would have." In December, Nora found a folder she hadn't opened. It was at the back of the second box, misfiled under a divider, smaller than the others, without a name label. Inside was a single ledger page, different from all the others, not Cass's cramped hand but an older hand, heavier, the ink gone brown at the edges. At the top, 1961. Below it, one entry. Given to Cass Gaines, age 36, mill repair after flood, $312. No repayment expected. He'll pay it forward when he can. They always do. Below it, a signature Nora couldn't fully make out, a first name that might have been Earl. She sat with it for a long time. Then she put it carefully back in the folder, and put the folder back in the box, and put the box on the shelf where Cass had kept it, where his father's generosity had been resting quietly for 60 years, waiting for someone to find the room above the wheel. On the last night of the year, Nora turned the lamp off and stood at the east window in the dark. Below, the creek was up from the rain. She could hear it over the turning of the wheel, the water moving fast and brown and cold, the way it always moved in winter, indifferent and ancient and exactly sufficient to keep the wheel going. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the photograph. She couldn't see it in the dark, but she knew it by touch, the soft edges, the crease down the center, Walter's shoulder against Cass's hand. She put it back. She picked up the red notebook from the table. She had worked through 37 of the 41 names. 4 remained. She opened it to the first of the 4 and read the name by the light from the stove's draft. She knew the family. She sat down at the table and uncapped a pen. Outside, the wheel turned. The creek moved under the winter stars. 38.